Basically, the reason why I don't buy the drugs, argument for why Trump is attacking Venezuela is, first of all, if you were really attacking the drugs, network, your target number one would be the global money laundering banks, because without money laundering, the drugs trade would practically vanish. Would collapse into a small fraction of what it is today. And I can explain that. But your second target would be Ecuador, and your third cut target would be Canada. If this was really about fighting drugs, Venezuela wouldn't even be target number one. You'd go after the global banks that launder cartel money. Because without money laundering, the drug trade dies overnight. Then you'd hit Ecuador, then Canada, but none of those get sanctions or regime change talk. So no, this isn't about drugs. It's about power, control, and resources. Drugs is just the excuse. Zero fentanyl goes into the United States from, Venezuela. And whatever else goes in there is again a fraction of what it used to be before Chavez. Because before Chavez, the CIA had their network in Venezuela, and they were the conduit for cocaine into the United States. The CIA was yes. Now, if you not knowing this for sure, but if somebody asked me to speculate, I would say for sure Maduro has a hand in this. But the reason is because the CIA is in the drugs trade up to their eyeballs. That's who's there, who their enemies are. So if you wanted to have intelligence about your enemies, you would penetrate those networks. And so you would have your people in the drug trade, because that's how you get close to your enemies, to collect the intelligence, to know what they're up to know what they're doing, who they are, where the stuff is moving, where the money is coming from, what weapons they have, what stuff they're dealing, and so forth. People don't realize this part of the game. If zero fent. Venezuela, in cocaine flow actually dropped after Chavez. Then why the outrage? Now, before Chavez, Venezuela was basically a freeway for US-bound drugs because the CIA had a network inside it. When intelligence agencies are that deep in the drug world, it stops being law enforcement and starts being business. So when Maduro pushes back, suddenly he becomes the villain. This isn't about stopping drugs. It's about losing control of a pipeline. So I think, you like it or not, you would have to be involved with that. Now, going back to the money laundering banks, because this is who is actually the kingpin of the whole network. Why? Because I'll take the example of Mexican drug cartels. They sell about $400 million worth of stuff in the United States per week, every week. And this is cash trade. This is not, credit card or, wire transfers or checks or invoices. This is cash transactions. And so, the Mexican drug cartels get about 40 million worth of cash every week. And then they have to transport this cash and store it somewhere. And then you have to keep it under guard in safe storage places, right? Safe warehouses. And then you have to pay armed men to guard your cash, right? And the thing with cash is that these armed guards could say, "Hey, why work for El Chapo Guzman when we can just take this money ourselves and start our own drug cartel, kill off a bunch of his people, and look at all these hundreds of millions that are just here under our noses." So there'll be a huge incentive to do that. Not only that, anybody with cash in hands has a certain power of the purse, right? Whatever that cash in their hand is. And so you'd have a lot of little aspiring cartel leaders wanting to pull in their own direction. And so that would be very million a week in cash into the US. And cash creates chaos. You need warehouses, armed guards, transport, all of which invites theft, splinter gangs, and violence. Money in hand is power. And once that power is mobile, every lieutenant becomes a potential rival. So you don't dismantle the drug trade by chasing couriers. You do it by choking the financial arteries. Cut the banks. Cut the incentive. Everything else unravels. It would splinter immediately into 1,000 rival factions. Now, the another problem with cash in on pallets is that there's only so much stuff you can spend it on. So you can buy a lot of champagne caviar. Maybe you can buy fancy cars. Maybe you can buy villas. Maybe you can pay prostitutes. But you're very limited in what you can use cash for. And at a certain point, the curve flattens. There's not much more that you can ceiling. But without banking access, it becomes useless. There's only so many cars, girls, and champagne you can buy before the cash stops being power. Real power isn't in holding money, it's in moving it. That's why the banks are the real cartel. And we know from official US government investigations, investigative reports, that these cartels have submarines, helicopter, howitzers, they have anti-tank missiles, they have all kinds of stuff. They maintain real armies with which they fight against the Mexican government. And that takes a lot of money, and it can't be paid by cash. You can't buy a submarine with cash. You can't buy a helicopter with cash. So to do all that, you need to have money in a clean bank account. Official reports don't mince words. These cartels aren't street gangs. They're armies with submarines, helicopters, howitzers, even anti-tank missiles. You can't buy that hardware off a suitcase of cash. Big weapons, logistics, and sustained pay for fighters require clean bank accounts and international transfers. In short, when cartels go industrial, banks become their weapons suppliers. Once the money is in a clean bank account, there's a signatory to that account, right? And then only that guy has the power of the purse, because everybody else gets the money from him. The payrolls come through him. And in that sense, the bank anoints the leader of the cartel. They say, "Mr. El Chapo Guzman, you're the man. We only recognize your signature, and maybe your CFO's signature, to authorize these transactions. You're buying a helicopter. Well, very well. With your signature, we'll make that payment. You mean you need to meet the payrolls for the troops, for all your thugs there? Very well. You know, it is. Who creates the whole hierarchy and reinforces it? Because they designate the guy whose signatures they recognize, and he can use the money that's in the account clean. And he's the only man with the power of the person in the organization. The banks can't not know what this is. They have the know your customer legal obligation. These people turn so much money that even the CEO of the bank in London or on Wall Street must know who this is, what this money represents, where it's coming from, and they would have to even go inspect these, whatever facilities that produce this money. So there's no chance, there's no whatever. Yes, this is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Once the money is clean, power isn't in the cartel anymore. It's in the bank, because the bank decides whose signature matters. The moment they say billions flowing through the system, you can't pretend the CEOs don't know. They know exactly whose empire they're endorsing. So the banks know. They absolutely know, and they anoint the leaders of the cartel. And then also, if the banks get abusive, let's say they take 30% for money laundering services. So you bring them 100 million bucks. You get 70. They get 30. And then one day decide, what? I think from now on, it's going to be 50-50. We're going to take half. What is he going to do then? Is he going to shoot the bank manager? He can do that. But the people on Wall Street or in London, they don't care. They're going to appoint another CEO. The bank? Nothing happens to the bank. You can go shoot all the personnel in the bank. You didn't kill the bank. You just killed a bunch of people who work. So the bank is separate from the dirty and ugly business of drug dealing. But by providing the money laundering service, they make the whole thing possible. At the end of the day, the product isn't what gives power. Access to the financial system does. Banks decide whose signature moves the money, so they quietly determine who stays in charge. Real power isn't in earning money. It's in controlling who gets to use it. Without the money laundering service, the nature of the problem is such that the cartels would instantly splinter. They would probably eliminate them themselves, between themselves, by fighting one faction against the other, and whatever is remained would probably be relatively easy for law enforcement to mop up and clean out. And so that's where you attack money, the drugs trade, first and foremost, and then maybe major hubs like Canada and Ecuador. I do believe that eventually they're going to get around to it, because I did watch a podcast in which one of Trump's FBI agents was actually talking about all this, but he was talking about it with respect to Canada. That was a couple of months ago when they busted an absolutely massive fentanyl lab in Canada. They said this thing was absolutely huge, and a lot of fentanyl was coming into the United States from there. And we know that it's not the only one. And then in that whole interview, he also made this whole argument about the banks. It's the banks. The banks are the kingpin of this whole thing, whole operation, which tells me that the Trump administration, people at the, in the FBI or wherever, know exactly the problem that they're dealing with. Whatever the reason is, they're running a fake war now, in a similar way that they were running a fake war against Ansarallah in Yemen. After Ansarallah's being bombed for 10 years, Trump suddenly decides now we're ever seen before, and all this talk. And then, what happened with that? Nothing. They did bomb a bunch of, because I guess they have to make it look real and credible. People have to believe that it's for real. But it obviously wasn't. And Saris is still in power, and there's no war anymore. If you cut off the financial system, the entire operation collapses. Without access to clean money, these groups wouldn't stay united. They'd break into smaller factions, and law enforcement could handle them. That's why the real choke point isn't the product, it's the money. And even officials have admitted that major financial hubs, not just foreign countries, play a huge role. When the focus shifts to banks, the whole picture changes. Sometimes what looks like a war is really just theater, actions taken ever seen before, and all this talk. And then, what happened with that? Nothing. They did bomb a bunch of, because I guess they have to make it look real and credible. People have to believe that it's for real, but it obviously wasn't. Ansarallah is still in power, and there's no war anymore. If you cut off the financial system, the entire operation collapses. Without access to clean money, these groups wouldn't stay united. They'd break into smaller factions, and law enforcement could handle them. That's why the real choke point isn't the product, it's the money. And even officials have admitted that major financial hubs, not just foreign countries, play a huge role. When the focus shifts to banks, the whole picture changes. Sometimes what looks like a war is really just theater. Actions taken to look serious,